The most devastating message you can ever send to a narcissist is not filled with anger, dramatic outbursts, or long-winded arguments. It is entirely calm, and the moment that message is delivered, you simply step back and disappear. Because when they finally realize that you are no longer reacting to their games, no longer offering long explanations, and no longer holding on to desperate hope, the entire power dynamic instantly collapses. If this message reaches you today, take a slow breath, pause for just a moment, and remind yourself that you do not need to construct the perfect words to earn your freedom. What you truly need is the quiet courage to stop explaining yourself. If you are seeking deeper clarity on setting firm boundaries, finding personal healing, and practicing true emotional detachment, stay present with this conversation. The most effective and powerful farewell is one that is completely neutral in tone. This is because narcissistic dynamics are never driven by logic, reason, or actual truth. Instead, they are fueled by a constant need to regulate their own fragile emotions through the reactions of other people. When you display strong emotional energy, whether that takes the form of love, intense anger, deep grief, explosive rage, or sheer desperation, you are still actively participating in the very system that keeps them psychologically nourished. Emotional neutrality completely removes you from that endless cycle. It sends an unmistakable signal that you are no longer available to absorb their chaotic energy, reflect their demands, or stabilize their internal turbulence. This level of calm is profoundly unsettling to someone who relies entirely on external reactions just to feel real, important, or in control. A dramatic, high-energy goodbye might feel satisfying for a brief moment, but in reality, it only reassures the narcissist that they still hold a central place in your life and still possess access to your emotional core. Even your raw anger serves as confirmation of their significance to you. Even your tears act as proof of their lingering power over your mind and heart. Emotional neutrality, on the other hand, communicates a reality that is far more unsettling to them. It shows that you have already processed the grief and loss within yourself. You are no longer striving to be seen, understood, or validated by them. You are no longer pleading for repair, nor are you negotiating your self-worth in their presence. This state of neutrality is frequently mistaken for coldness, but it is not cold at all. It is simply a state of deep self-regulation. It represents the quiet voice of someone who has finally stopped hoping that the other person will suddenly gain insight, demonstrate genuine empathy, or accept meaningful accountability. It reflects your full emotional graduation from their repetitive cycle. A narcissist naturally expects emotional intensity because that intensity is what keeps the psychological bond alive and active. Your calm completely disrupts their expected model of how you operate. They suddenly find themselves completely unable to figure out how to pull you back into the drama, provoke a heated reaction, or reset the imbalance of power. Beyond that, an emotionally neutral farewell serves as a strong shield for your own well-being. By stripping away all emotional drama from your words, you prevent future self-betrayal. You leave behind no loose threads for them to twist, mock, argue against, or use as an excuse to re-establish contact. You give them absolutely no raw material to work with. You are effectively closing the door without slamming it shut, which paradoxically feels far more final and permanent than any explosive rage ever could. Choosing neutrality is not about being overly polite or overly kind to them. It is about staying deeply loyal to your own nervous system. It is a firm statement that you are no longer open for business when it comes to chaos, unnecessary drama, or endless emotional labor. It demonstrates that you have stopped confusing emotional intensity with genuine human connection, and that you no longer mistake suffering for proof of love. When that realization finally sinks in, it quietly dismantles the entire dynamic that they relied upon to feel powerful. The experience of narcissistic injury does not stem from being disliked, criticized, or even publicly exposed. It is triggered by a sudden and complete loss of control over the surrounding emotional environment. Maintaining control is the primary way a narcissist preserves their internal balance. They actively regulate their fragile self-worth by provoking strong reactions, controlling the story, and constantly positioning themselves at the very center of the relationship. When that control vanishes, the resulting injury cuts infinitely deeper than any personal insult ever could. While anger, confrontation, and heated arguments might feel like expressions of strength, to a narcissist, they are simply evidence that they still hold influence over you. As long as they retain the ability to make you cry, debate, defend your character, or express your deep pain, they remain in command of the emotional space. Even rejection, when delivered with passionate emotion, keeps them feeling relevant. It reassures them that they still matter enough to stir your soul. This is precisely why attempting to call them out or expose them so frequently backfires. Exposure grants them the focus and attention they crave, and that attention acts to restore their sense of power. What truly destabilizes their reality is the quiet realization that they no longer possess access to your emotional responses. They do not view your calm demeanor as a sign of maturity. They view it as a direct threat. When you cease responding with emotion, they experience it as the sudden destruction of the mirror they once used to view themselves. Without that external mirror, their internal structure begins to shake and wobble. This internal collapse represents the very essence of narcissistic injury. A loss of control also completely shatters their carefully constructed narratives. Narcissists rely heavily on predictable, assigned roles within their relationships, such as the persistent pursuer, the eager pleaser, the constant fixer, or the defensive explainer. When you step completely out of your assigned role without creating a scene, they find themselves unable to force you into another position. In response, they may try to bait you using guilt, fond memories from the past, or sudden acts of kindness. They do not do this out of genuine care, but out of a desperate attempt to regain their own internal regulation. If those manipulation tactics fail to provoke you, their underlying panic rapidly escalates. This explains why your quiet indifference is so often followed by their sudden, erratic behavior. The injury they feel is never about losing you as a human being. It is entirely about losing complete authority over your internal world. They are forced to face the terrifying truth that they are no longer the central point around which your emotions revolve. That precise moment marks the collapse of the power dynamic, not because you launched an attack against them, but because you quietly and completely removed yourself from their influence. The impulse to explain yourself feels entirely natural because healthy, balanced relationships actively reward open communication, mutual accountability, and sincere reconciliation. Within narcissistic dynamics, however, detailed explanation becomes a dangerous trap. When you offer an explanation, you are not being heard with the goal of understanding. You are simply being analyzed for future leverage. Every personal detail you share provides them with valuable information about your core values, your deep fears, your boundaries, and your emotional pressure points. What you view as an attempt at honest communication is viewed by them as pure data collection. Over-explaining serves to keep the unhealthy cycle alive because it signals an underlying uncertainty. The simple act of explaining implies that the other person holds the rightful authority to evaluate your reasons, approve your choices, or debate your personal reality. Narcissists flourish in that specific realm. They do not seek resolution or peaceful understanding. They seek continuous engagement. Whenever you try to explain why you are choosing to leave, why a specific action caused you pain, or why a boundary must exist, they process your words as an open invitation to argue, invalidate, minimize, or rewrite the narrative. The entire conversation quickly shifts away from your original decision and becomes focused on their twisted interpretation of it. This is why clear explanations are so consistently met with pretended confusion, outright denial, or intentional misunderstanding. It is never a case of your words lacking clarity. It is simply that clarity would bring an absolute end to the interaction, and ending the interaction threatens their hold over you. They will twist your words into claims that you are overly emotional, mentally unstable, selfish, overly dramatic, or confused. Before you know it, you find yourself explaining your previous explanation, defending your defense, and justifying your original justification, while the true issue at hand quietly fades into the background. Real clarity, by contrast, is brief, direct, and non-negotiable. Clarity never begs to be understood or validated. It simply states a firm position and fully accepts that the other person may dislike it. It carries the weight of a final decision rather than a desperate plea. When you operate from true clarity, you are no longer trying to manage their emotional state or fix their distorted perception of who you are. You are simply defining your boundary and stepping forward in complete alignment with it. Pure clarity brings the entire cycle to a sudden halt because it strips away the narcissist's favorite weapon, which is debate. It leaves them with nothing to dissect, no emotional strings to pull, and no vulnerable feelings to exploit. It completely denies them the dramatic stage for conflict and strips away their illusion of control. Most importantly, true clarity shields you from the pain of self-abandonment. You finally stop over-explaining in a desperate effort to be understood, and you begin standing firmly in your own truth without needing agreement, validation, or empathy from someone who has repeatedly proven they are entirely incapable of offering it. Indifference is frequently misunderstood as a form of weakness or passive avoidance, but in truth, it is the ultimate expression of quiet strength. But within the hidden dynamics of a narcissistic relationship, quiet indifference is actually the single most destabilizing and deeply unsettling response you could ever possibly offer. Narcissists are psychological creatures who are constantly calibrated to high emotional intensity. They live for your reactions because your reactions serve as tangible proof that they still hold power over your world. Whether your response is built on affection, burning rage, bitter jealousy, or complete heartbreak, the specific emotion does not matter nearly as much as the simple fact that a response exists at all. True indifference completely removes that vital confirmation from their hands. It communicates something far more profound than anger. It signals a total absence of emotional investment, and that absolute void is precisely what makes it feel so terrifyingly threatening to them. When you react with strong emotion, the narcissist immediately feels oriented and secure. They know exactly where they stand inside your internal world. They can easily adjust their ongoing behavior to regain the upper hand, escalate the conflict, or pull you back into their web of drama. Indifference completely erases that familiar map. Without your reactions, they can no longer gauge whether they still matter to you, whether they are winning the psychological game, or whether they still retain access to your heart and mind. This profound state of uncertainty generates far more internal distress for them than open, explosive conflict ever could. Direct confrontation often gives us a false illusion of personal power because standing up for ourselves feels brave and assertive. In reality, however, confrontation still places the narcissist directly at the center of the universe. It sends a clear signal that they are still important enough to justify your precious time, energy, and emotional bandwidth. Even the act of calling out their toxic behavior can easily turn into just another form of dynamic engagement if it leads to back-and-forth arguments, defensive excuses, or prolonged interaction. Indifference firmly refuses to play that game. It does not waste effort trying to correct their actions, expose their flaws, or punish them for what they have done. It simply and quietly withdraws all remaining emotional energy. This deliberate withdrawal of energy is not a passive surrender. It is a deeply conscious, intentional shift of your focus away from the narcissist and directly back toward your own internal peace and stability. Practicing true indifference means that you are no longer constantly scanning the environment for their reactions, anticipating their next tactical move, or exhaustively rehearsing future conversations inside your head. You are no longer trying to force them to finally understand what they did wrong or how deeply they hurt you. You have stopped emotionally auditioning for a sense of closure that will never arrive. To the narcissist, this complete withdrawal feels like being abruptly replaced by absolute nothingness. They are not being replaced by another romantic rival, nor by a dramatic cinematic exit, but rather by an empty vacuum where your constant focus and energy used to live. That sudden absence is entirely intolerable to them because it brutally exposes the fragile truth they work so hard to avoid. Their entire inflated sense of self-importance was simply borrowed from your emotional engagement all along. The very moment that engagement vanishes, their perceived power disappears right along with it. Indifference does not make a grand speech to declare victory. It simply changes the conditions so entirely that the game becomes impossible for them to continue playing. We often imagine closure as a healthy, mature conversation where two people finally hear each other out, acknowledge the shared pain, and go their separate ways with mutual clarity and respect. In relationships with a narcissist, however, holding on to that romantic fantasy becomes an endless source of personal suffering. Narcissists are fundamentally uninvested in achieving mutual understanding or true emotional resolution. Their sole investment is in preserving their defensive self-image and maintaining psychological control. Waiting around for a narcissist to give you closure means surrendering your personal healing into the hands of someone who directly profits from keeping you confused, hurt, and unsettled. This is why attempts to extract genuine closure from a narcissist almost always end in greater confusion rather than relief. They will happily minimize your lived experience, deny past events ever happened, rewrite history on the spot, or suddenly flip the script to play the defenseless victim. Every single one of these defensive tactics serves to destabilize you further, pulling you right back into the exact same cycle you are trying so hard to escape. Holding on to the hope for closure keeps you emotionally tethered to them, forcing you to constantly revisit the painful relationship in a desperate search for a moment of clarity that will finally make everything make sense. Self-generated closure works in a completely different way. It begins the exact moment you accept that understanding their complex motives is not required for your personal healing. You do not need their confession, their apology, or their sudden psychological insight for your pain to be valid and real. True closure is an internal, personal decision to stop seeking honest answers from someone who has consistently demonstrated a commitment to distorting the truth. It is the precise moment you stop asking why they treated you the way they did and instead begin acknowledging the heavy cost that remaining in the relationship demanded from your soul. Giving yourself closure also requires you to grieve what you deeply hoped the relationship could become, rather than clinging to what it actually was. So many people remain stuck in toxic cycles because they are deeply attached to unfulfilled potential, to those early moments of intense romance, or to the ideal version of the narcissist they kept believing would eventually emerge. Authentic closure arrives when you finally recognize that all that potential was simply part of the initial illusion, not an unfinished love story waiting to be completed. This quiet internal process restores your personal agency. You are no longer waiting on the edge of your seat for the other person to say the perfect words or magically change their behavior so that you can finally move forward with your life. Instead, you decide on your own terms that the chapter is officially over simply because continuing to reread the same painful pages is actively harming your soul. Closure, when understood in this way, is not a final gift given to you by someone else. It is an intentional ending that you choose for yourself, deeply grounded in self-respect rather than mutual agreement, and sustained by your firm willingness to stop reopening your old wounds in search of validation from someone who was never capable of offering it in the first place. A final goodbye message only ever works when it is immediately followed by absolute, unbroken silence, because that silence is the exact force that transforms simple words into an immovable boundary. Without following up with complete silence, your message becomes just another piece of dialogue, another emotional loop that the narcissist can easily step into, manipulate, and prolong indefinitely. The true power of a final message never rests in how cleverly it is phrased, but rather in the permanent behavioral shift that takes place directly after it is sent. Silence communicates what spoken words never can, declaring loudly that all access to your life has been permanently revoked. Narcissists are deeply conditioned to constantly test boundaries. When you send a final message and then remain open to receiving their responses, they quickly learn that your limits are completely negotiable. They might reply with overwhelming guilt, fake charm, explosive rage, feigned confusion, or sudden heartbreaking vulnerability. They do not do this because they are reflecting on their behavior, but because they are actively probing your shield for weak points and cracks. Any reply you give them, even a cold and calm one, teaches them that persistent pressure eventually works. Silence completely shuts down that learning process. It removes all emotional feedback from the environment, and without feedback, they find themselves entirely unable to adjust their manipulation tactics. Silence also serves as a critical shield that protects you from your own emotional regression. In the hours and days following a final goodbye message, your internal emotions will often surge violently. Intense doubt will naturally creep into your mind. You may feel a powerful urge to clarify your statements, soften your stance, or offer them comfort. Giving in to the urge to respond in those vulnerable moments almost always leads to a painful self-betrayal because it opens up a door that you intentionally chose to close. Remaining silent gives your nervous system the vital time it needs to settle and recalibrate. It allows your difficult decision to truly take root inside your body without being immediately challenged or picked apart by someone else. From the specific perspective of the narcissist, absolute silence is completely intolerable because it deprives them of control. They are stripped of the ability to rewrite the narrative in real time. They can no longer provoke a reaction out of you to reestablish their dominance. They are left entirely alone with their own chaotic thoughts, which frequently triggers intense obsession, sudden escalation, or desperate attempts at grand reconciliation. It is crucial to realize that none of these dramatic responses indicate genuine personal growth on their part. They simply indicate extreme distress over the sudden loss of access to your life. Importantly, choosing silence is not a form of childish punishment. It is not a passive-aggressive tactic designed to inflict pain on them. It is a protective measure designed entirely to preserve your own sanity and well-being. When complete silence follows your final message, it signals a state of true emotional completion. You are no longer actively negotiating reality, defending your personal perceptions, or begging for mutual understanding. You are behaving as though the decision has already been finalized, precisely because it has. This is why breaking your silence weeks or months later feels so deeply destabilizing to your spirit. It retroactively collapses the firm boundary you worked so hard to build, and it reinforces their toxic belief that your personal limits are merely temporary setbacks. When your silence is strictly maintained, your original goodbye message becomes truly irreversible in practice, rather than just in theory. Silence is the physical action that converts your good intentions into lasting freedom, confirming that your final goodbye was not a clever manipulation tactic, but a final conclusion rooted in deep self-respect and total emotional finality. Boundaries almost always feel deeply cruel to a narcissist because they experience them not as healthy, reasonable limits, but as an intolerable loss of their personal leverage over you. In healthy, balanced human relationships, personal boundaries are naturally understood as essential tools for self-protection and mutual respect. Within narcissistic dynamics, however, any boundary you set is immediately interpreted as a personal rejection, an act of defiance, or a malicious attack, simply because it directly interferes with their ability to use you for their own emotional regulation. When you set a firm boundary, you are not simply saying no to a specific behavior. You are explicitly saying no to their ongoing access to your life. Narcissists rely heavily on emotional permeability. They genuinely need to be able to intrude into your personal space, provoke your feelings, and influence your mental state in order to feel important and significant. Setting boundaries directly disrupts this pattern by creating clear separation where there used to be deep emotional enmeshment. This sudden, total absence of access is deeply destabilizing to them because it completely removes their sense of control over the relational field. They can no longer reach directly into your world and adjust your internal emotions to suit their immediate needs. This is precisely why setting a boundary so often provokes a wildly disproportionate reaction. What feels like a simple, healthy statement of personal limits to you feels to them like an act of sudden abandonment or deep public humiliation. In response, they may lash out and accuse you of being cold, selfish, unforgiving, or downright cruel. These harsh accusations are never accurate reflections of your character or behavior. They are simply raw expressions of emotional distress over losing their leverage. By framing your reasonable boundary as a form of personal harm against them, they are attempting to manipulate you through guilt so that you will reopen access to your life. Boundaries are also deeply threatening because they lay bare the narcissist's complete emotional dependence on you. The moment you stop accommodating their every whim, fixing their endless problems, or absorbing their emotional fallout, it becomes abundantly clear just how much of their self-regulation they were outsourcing directly to you. This sudden exposure feels profoundly uncomfortable for them. Rather than sitting with that discomfort and reflecting on their actions, they usually choose to attack the boundary itself, stubbornly insisting that it is entirely unnecessary, unfair, or mean-spirited. Maintaining your boundaries over time requires complete emotional consistency, not continuous explanation. Every single time you step up to defend, justify, or debate a boundary, you actively weaken its core function by turning a firm limit into an open discussion. Boundaries only truly work when they are consistently enacted through behavioral action, rather than continuously argued about verbally. This is why your consistent follow-through matters infinitely more than your exact choice of words.